Welcome to the Innovation Ecosystem Podcast, where we interview remarkable and thought-provoking guests from the worlds of business, academia, sports, science, and the arts. We firmly believe that while innovation is simple, it is not easy. It requires an open mind. It requires cognitive diversity. It requires curiosity, which is why on this podcast, we explore the subjects of innovation and change from multiple perspectives. We look at topics through different lenses. We hear about how small I innovations can compound over time. We show you how you can exercise your innovation muscles and make you and your organisation more innovative and better able to respond to change. With your host, Mark Bidwell.
Hello, this is Mark Bidwell. Welcome back to the Innovation Ecosystem Podcast. And if this is your first time listening, a very warm welcome. Got a great treat for you today. In this episode, I'm joined by Angela Duckworth, who is Professor of Psychology at the University of Pennsylvania and author of the book Grit, The Power of Passion and Perseverance. And Angela's also been the winner of the MacArthur Genius Fellowship, which is a highly prestigious award given to those who've shown extraordinary originality and dedication in their creative pursuits. Now, the concept of grit being a predictor of success has been popularized by Angela's research in her book, as well as her TED Talk on the subject, which has been viewed well over 15 million times. And in the conversation I had with Angela, we drill down into what she means here by passion, how it begins and how it evolves, and also perseverance and its somewhat unglamorous role in, as she describes it, the mundanity of excellence. But we started our conversation with a bias which we rarely talk about and which as leaders we do need to watch out for, the naturalness bias. And this is our tendency to prefer skill to be attributable to raw talent rather than deliberate practice. And as with any bias, being unaware of it increases our risk of making poor decisions. Now, in the conversation, we also cover the difference between perseverance and stubbornness and our need to be flexible in the tactics that we use to achieve our top-level goals. And we discuss the three-step process that Warren Buffett gave his pilot for prioritizing goals. And as we always look to provide potential takeaways for our listeners, we discuss what leaders can do not only to develop their own grit, but also that of their organizations to build a gritty organization. So this is a very rich conversation full of insights that I have to say I'm still reflecting on and processing several weeks after the conversation. So I hope you enjoy my conversation with Angela Duckworth. Well, Angela, it's great to have you on the program. Let me start with getting into your book by Simon Sinek's quote, where he says, "I love an idea that challenges our conventional wisdom, and Grit, your book, does just that." So what piece of conventional wisdom does your book challenge?
Talent is so often our go-to answer when we see someone do something really remarkable. I mean, even before we think about it, out of our mouths comes something like, wow, what a natural. And I've gotten that compliment, after whatever, a talk or, maybe writing something that was better than average for me. And I resist that because talent is not always or necessarily what makes people great. In fact, I think when you look at greatness, you very often find the common denominator is passion and perseverance.
And that's at the heart of your definition of grit, I guess, passion and perseverance?
Exactly so. When I interviewed high achievers in the arts and in science, politics, and business, at the very beginning of my research career, it was very clear to me that these people had a kind of special stamina. They stayed interested, committed, and in love with their goals, and they were incredibly hardworking about them.
And I guess you got a dose of that when you went to work in McKinsey, right? Because that characterizes, particularly the incredibly hardworking piece, characterizes life as a new associate in McKinsey.
Well, what's interesting is that at McKinsey, I worked very long days. I mean, I worked from pre-dawn to long after the sunset, but I don't think I had passion for what I did. I am sure there are many consultants who have passion for what they do, but unless you really feel like, even in my off hours, I'm thinking about this, then I don't think that qualifies to me in the way that I'm using the word as grit. If you are, however, like Eric Ripert, the great 3-star Michelin chef in New York, and you come home after a 20-hour shift, and the first thing you do is make an omelet to see if you can make the omelet better, then I think that's grit.
And that's a true story. Is that what he does?
That was a story from his youth. And when he became more and more in love with cooking, and I want to emphasize that because some people think, oh, it strikes you like a lightning bolt, your passion. In fact, it typically takes years to truly develop a passion. It gets deeper and deeper. But he found himself, it's true, coming home after 20-hour days and, dead tired. Can you imagine how hard that life would be? And he wanted to cook and he thought about cooking and he did cook even in those few off hours that he had.
We'll come back to passion in a minute, but I mean, this kind of bias, you talk about it as the naturalness bias, this hidden prejudice against those who've achieved things because they worked for it versus a preference for those who we think arrive at their place in life because they're naturally talented. I mean, what's behind this? Why does this naturalness bias actually exist?
This is actually the work of my good friend and collaborator, Chia Jung Se, who has found that when you look at expertise and you have somebody who's actually equivalent in skill to someone who is there because of a natural talent. And, so on the one hand, you've got a striver who worked hard, and then the other, you have a natural who didn't have to work as hard, that we have a bias, especially actually if we're experts ourselves, interestingly, to favor the natural. Now, why is that? Gia and I are actually working on that very problem, and we don't have a complete answer. But I will say this, I think for many of us, there's a kind of shame in having to have had, more hours under our belt to get to the same place. And wouldn't all of us rather be the natural who got there effortlessly?
Yeah. There are certain organizations, I guess, that where this bias is alive and well, and it's very, very much at the heart of its DNA, I guess.
I think that for a lot of people who actually do great things, they almost identify as the person who was really smart. And then there are others who identify themselves as having gotten there through hard work. And I think the thing is this, when you're winning and when everything is going well, it doesn't really matter that much which of these mindsets you have. But if things are not going well and you have a couple of bad seasons or a few, bad weeks at work, then I think the natural mindset is very fragile. And I think of myself as someone who grew up never thinking she was a genius. And I think in a way, in the long run, that benefited me. When things go badly, as they sometimes do, I don't worry that like, oh, well, maybe I'm not a genius. I just think, well, how can I work around this problem?
Yeah. And then there's the other sort of angle to this, which is the swimmers, the successful swimmers that were studied. I think you said that, where you can't explain their success, we defer to talent, because it's much easier label to put on it versus trying to explain how they're successful.
When we can't figure something out, we often just say like, well, I guess it's talent. And that was actually the insight of a sociologist who lived with swim teams from the, swim team around the corner all the way up in competitiveness to Olympic hopefuls. And his name is Dan Chambliss. And after 6 years of living with swimmers and he himself having been a competitive swimmer for most of his life, he wrote a paper about how talent becomes this kind of catch-all term for like, well, I don't know how she does it. And I think the demystification of success is one of the things I hope to dedicate my whole life to, because the sort of like, well, I guess it's just a mysterious, I don't know what it is, je ne sais quoi, is a way of giving up. And if we instead you require ourselves to keep asking, well, it must be something, then some of those things, we might find like height or how flexible your feet are, you can't really change very easily. But other things like your stroke and your technique and how you breathe and your practice schedule, those other things we can do something about. And that to me gives me hope.
Yeah, yeah. There's a great article, the title of the article on them, and I'm not sure how to pronounce this, the mundanity of excellence, which struck me as being quite relevant here.
Exactly. And in fact, it's the work of the very same sociologist. And his observation of these Olympic hopefuls was that when there would be journalists, for example, who would want to come from afar and see greatness in action, they would quickly get bored because essentially what they would have to witness is practices at 4:30 in the morning that would last several hours, that would go through certain, well, we're going to do 5 100s and then we're going to do 3 200s and then we're going to, swim with our kickboards. And that would happen on a Monday and then a Tuesday and a Wednesday. And by Thursday, many of these journalists were kind of wondering when the magic would start happening. When would it look like it looks on television at the actual Olympics? And the mundanity of excellence across all the fields that I have studied is exactly that. There is a kind of daily ritual of working on your craft that isn't especially glamorous. And I think the people who become true champions learn to love that discipline. And of course, they love the spotlight and those occasional, dazzling days where everybody's looking at you and you get to show everyone what you've earned. But you also begin to love and respect the daily grind.
Yeah. I mean, it's similar in this field of innovation because, I mean, there's so much hype around, the Steve Jobs and the Elon Musks and, they have these breakthroughs, it's the people in the white coats or it's the people in the, doing the coding where everything comes from. But in actual fact, it's small incremental improvements that compound over time. That's where the bulk of innovation actually occurs from.
I completely agree. Now, I will say this, it's not that people never have insights, right? Epiphanies or, jumps in our understanding. You wake up and you just have a great idea. And you might say, well, that doesn't seem very gradual at all. It was very sudden. But what enables somebody to have an insight that nobody else has had before? I contend that you have to have muddled on that problem.
Yeah.
Thought about it from every angle. And that's how Isaac Newton came up with the laws of mechanics. That is how Einstein came up with the theory of relativity. It wasn't that they just, were doing other things and then one day had a revelation. If you want to have an original insight, you have to think about something for a very, very long time.
Yeah, absolutely. But of course, it doesn't sell books and it doesn't make good stories, and journalists don't enjoy covering that side of it. But yeah, so one of the things as I was reading through this book, Angela, was my question was when to stop persevering. And I love the Warren Buffett goal setting exercise. I mean, that sheds some light on that question.
There is a possibility that people are too persevering, but I think the more accurate way of phrasing that is that you could be too stubborn about the wrong goals. Now, here's what I mean. Say, for example, you're working on a project or you've got a certain client that you're courting and it's just not going very well. And you've tried every which angle and it's still not going well. Now, if you're stubborn and you won't give up on that project or that client, no matter what, you could actually be doing the wrong thing. For example, if you are dedicated to film cameras in the age of digital photography, that's a losing strategy. Now, where you should be stubborn, and this is my advice to entrepreneurs and others, is that you should be stubborn about your top level goals, those abstract things that really give you meaning and purpose. For example, if you work for Polaroid, maybe your top level goal is to help people share memories through visual media. But that can be film in the conventional sense, but it also can be digital photography and can be many other things. Stay true to your top level goals and be infinitely flexible and adaptive about your low level ones.
As I said, I mean, I mentioned Warren Buffett. I mean, he gave this advice, I think, to his pilot. I mean, I'd be fascinated if you could just share, what was your experience, processing his advice in that context?
So the Warren Buffett advice is to make a list of all your goals and then to circle your 5 most important goals. And then make another list of your non-important goals, the ones you didn't circle, and avoid them at all costs. And that's the real heart of it, that you're supposed to actually spend a lot of energy decidedly avoiding the things that are not priorities. And in fact, when people struggle with priorities, it's not that they have a problem with the priorities. It's a discipline of not thinking too much about the things that are not as important. I struggled that as well. And when I did the Warren Buffett exercise, I found that I could go one step further. I saw what he meant by prioritizing, and that was helpful. But I also tried to do one more thing, and that is to find a theme among the 5 things that I circled. In other words, of the things that are important to me, why is it that these stand out and the others fade? And for me, it ended up being a theme about kids. I care more about kids than other people. And it was about psychological science. That is my tool for helping kids. And it could be other things for other people. So for me, everything that I do, I try to now line up with, does this help kids? And is it working to my strength as a psychological scientist?
Fascinating. I mean, a powerful exercise. And I have to say, I mean, I love reading your description of it, and I still haven't done it because I'm a little bit scared about it. So there are 4 assets in the second half of the book that you talk about, and we've touched on a couple of them, but maybe we can just go through them very quickly. I mean, can you give us an outline of the 4 assets?
I'm going to tell you about these assets in the developmental order in which they appear. First, usually during middle childhood and maybe early adolescence, there's the beginning of an interest, something that makes you curious. And it's around that time, our early teenage years, that we begin to have interests that are sharply defined, or at least more sharply than childhood, where, everything's interesting to you. So for some of us, it will be people, and, maybe that will incline you to sales. And for others, it will be, art and drawing. So that's the first stage, is to really identify and to cultivate a personal, intrinsically interesting pursuit. The second developmental stage tends to happen during later adolescence and early adulthood, and that is the beginning of deliberate practice, a routine of working on weaknesses with feedback and repetition, the kind of work that we were talking about just a moment ago with those swimmers. But in fact, deliberate practice is possible and in fact necessary in any field, whether you're going to be a mathematician or, a salesperson.
Can I interrupt you there, Angela? Because there was something in there that really struck out. I think you mentioned in the book, this could be up to 70%, solo behind the scenes practice. Did I read that correctly?
It's very often the case that people, when they are truly practicing at the edge of their skills, are doing it alone, as opposed to in a group or in a room where there's other people. For example, the great basketball legend Kevin Durant has said that 70% or more of his time in basketball is practicing alone. Now, that's extraordinarily interesting given that basketball is a team sport. Now, I think there are people out there who are not going to be able to think of how they could practice alone. It's just the nature of what they do. I mean, maybe you're a leader, and how do you practice leading alone? So I think the question is, why is the alone thing there at all? And I think it's because of concentration and focus. The lesson for all of us is when you are practicing deliberately, you must be as focused as possible. And for many of us, that's just harder to do when we've got a lot of other people around us. And whatever you do for a living, you should think, how do I get to 100% focus?
Yeah. As I read that, I was thinking, when I've had some big presentations to investors, for instance, because I was with the public company before, the amount of preparation I did, I didn't calculate it, but 70%, I did a huge amount, but 70% is an enormous number, isn't it?
It really is. And, again, I think people should, take that number and just figure out like what works for them. But I'm sure you have done work, when you really have to solve a hard problem. My guess is that you don't do it with a lot of other people who are talking to you. There's some amount of quietness or solitude where you just have to concentrate. And I think that's the ideal.
Yep. Perfect. So that's second, then into purpose, which we touched on right at the beginning. Maybe you could say a bit about that.
The third and final stage of the evolution of a gritty high performer is a stage that really actually can last the rest of your life, right? So you started off with a childhood interest, and then you've cultivated it and you started practicing deliberately, maybe around your late teenage years or early adulthood. And now the final stage can last for the rest of your life. And that is to have a feeling that your work, though it's just, a childhood interest to some, for you has a purpose and a meaning. It gives meaning to all you do. Now, when you ask the question, well, what does that mean really to people? It very often, in fact, I've never seen an exception to this, means that you can see how your work benefits others. I'm guessing you feel like that about this very podcast, about the work you've done prior to this. I feel like that. And that's what it means to a human to be important, to matter. So this is something that I think people can cultivate just like they can cultivate curiosity or cultivate a habit of expert practice. And by that, I mean, look for the ways in which your work allies to other people's interests and in fact, shape your work, cultivate more of that. And I think if you ask me about the older people that I've interviewed, I've never met one who was truly fulfilled in a purposeful way who was unhappy. That's the third and final stage. But you might ask, well, why did you have 4 chapters then? The fourth chapter is on hope. It's on having a mindset of optimism and growth that you really need, actually, no matter how old you are, whether you're 7 or 87. And that is because life is hard. And that is because you will fail. And that is because failure feels embarrassing and shameful. It rocks you to your core, whether you're 7 or 87. And the mindset that enables you to get up again is a mindset that says, whatever I am and whatever I've done, I know I can do better tomorrow. And that belief that human nature is malleable, that abilities can develop, that lessons can be learned and internalized is what makes some people get up. And of course, the lack of that helps, encourage people to do the opposite, which is just to lay down and not try again.
Yeah. And I'm reminded of the Stockdale Paradox, which I don't know if it's in the book or not. I don't think it is. Are you familiar with that?
I'm not. Can you tell me?
Well, it's. I think it was from an American prisoner of war veteran who then I think went on to be a senator. But he talked about the reason that people survived. He was in I think a Vietnamese camp. For being tortured. I mean, the horrendous story. He was asked afterwards how he survived, and he said, I survived because I was able to hold these 2 very, very conflicting views in my mind. One was that I was living in hell, and and the world was terrifyingly bad, not going to get any better. And the other was that actually I will emerge coming out the other side. So being able to hold these 2 views, and the people who didn't make it were either hopelessly optimistic or hopelessly pessimistic, but he was able to hold both of those and manage that ambiguity. And that's what he put down to his survival, if you like.
No, I think that's really insightful. And by hopefulness, I don't mean the kind of blind optimism that says, oh, it's going to turn out okay no matter what. That's not actually the kind of optimism that helps you, because that doesn't get you to do anything either, right? And actually, that turns you into a real easy target for enemies and predators and people who want to abuse you. So I think that's exactly, the point I'm trying to make, which is that the optimism is not that everything's going to turn out. The optimism is that I can do something here. And when we look at depressed people, an affliction which affects many more people than we might at first imagine, it's at the core, depression is a lack of hope. It's to really kind of lost that. And I think the fact that people do recover from depression actually is a lesson as well, because, hopelessness is not a permanent condition, and people can find ways of understanding their world and making sense of what's happened to them that gives hope as opposed to the opposite.
Yep. So, I mean, switching now gears a little bit, Angela, a lot of people will be listening and thinking, okay, I want to make, if they're running a large organization or a business unit, I want to train my organization, make it grittier, make the organization be more, have more grit. What can a leader do to render their organization gritty?
Yeah, I just wrote an article for this that was published, I think, last week for Harvard Business Review on the gritty organization. And I did that in part because I got this question from a lot of gritty leaders. Now, there are a lot of gritty artists who don't ask this question, or gritty solo performers. But if you are a gritty leader, the first question you wake up with is, how do I get everyone else in this organization to be gritty as well? The lesson in part is modeling. And I know that every leader is a role model just by default, but I think there can be an intentionality around that. I'll give you an example. So in my role as a professor, I get rejected a lot, and I have learned how to get rejected and how to learn from those rejections, because usually you get lots of very specific ways in which you were terrible, but from the reviewers on your articles. And I've learned to get up again, but I'm trying to intentionally role model that to my students by sending them my rejections. I literally forward them by email the rejections that say that I'm a total idiot and here's why. And I show them, by the way, also that I'm a human. I mean, I will tell them if I cried about it or if I was completely devastated. But I also model for them that, 1 day, 2 days, maybe it takes a week sometimes later, that I get up again and I look at those reviews and I highlight them and I make notes, and then I revise my article and I send it out again. A role model is always a role model, but an intentional role model can be very powerful indeed.
Love it. Love it. And from an individual point of view, I mean, I guess we touched on some of these things before. It is, it's making sure these 4 assets are in place, and you're intentional about nurturing, particularly the hope at the end, the optimism piece.
Yes, that's right. I think that there is, something that any of us on our own as individuals can do when we diagnose, what it is that makes us less gritty than we would like. I mean, maybe we don't feel like we have curiosity about what we do. Maybe we don't feel like we have a daily discipline of practice. Maybe we feel like we've lost touch with the larger purpose of our work, or maybe we feel like we slip into a pessimistic, this is never going to change mindset. You can diagnose yourself, and you can certainly use the science on those 4 human capabilities and to work on them. But I would like to say that people do not generally become gritty on their own. In fact, the paradox of grit might be that there is an enormous amount of support and investment in the development of gritty individuals that begins at the earliest days of childhood. And, it is a blessing if you feel like you came from a family like that. And if you didn't, then it's up to you, I think, to then seek out those mentors, role models, and lifelong relationships that will help you be your best.
Yeah, yeah. Tell me, I mean, just to stop thinking, where does grit get in the way?
Well, I think that one of the interesting possible conflicts with grit is this idea of creativity and thinking outside the box. I've had a long-standing debate about this with my very good friend and collaborator, Adam Grant, who studies creativity and originality. And I think it's not necessarily the case, and neither would Adam say this, that to be gritty means that you're unoriginal, or to be original means that you're not gritty. Picasso, for example, exemplified both. A ferociously hard worker with sustained passion from, very early days to the very last breath he took, and then enormous, maybe unparalleled creativity. But I do think there is something about wanting to try new things, which is a little bit at odds with staying on a course. The resolution of this is to, like I mentioned earlier, be creative and original about your tactics, Picasso, for example, there was no medium. He could take a bicycle seat and turn it into a sculpture, which he
Yep.
did, right?
Yep.
Drew on the back of napkins in cafes, worked in very conventional media as well, like oil. But also there was a constancy, a kind of, commitment, abiding love of just the visual arts. And that was his top level goal. So the lesson I think that Adam and I would both give is that be original and creative and outside the box thinking about all the ways that you can accomplish your goal. But if you keep changing the top level goal, you're also unlikely to get anywhere.
Yeah, absolutely. That's what it comes back to the Warren Buffett piece as well, I guess. I mean, and as you talk about Picasso, I saw his exhibition last month, and it's almost like this drumbeat that went throughout his whole career, but which showed up in slightly different manifestations, be it food, be it pottery, be it paintings, and absolutely, I see it's how you frame the question, I suppose, or it's how you frame your purpose, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, you'll notice that Picasso didn't decide to become like a jazz trumpetist and then like a politician and then he stuck with being an artist, and then in that domain he was enormously creative. And I think that is actually good advice for those of us, by the way, who make that choice. Some people ask me, well, what if I don't want that? I don't want to have a career that is, in one direction. I don't think it's a moral choice to be gritty or not. You can be a very, very good person without being greedy. But for many of us, and I will count myself among them, there's a kind of dissatisfaction when you are starting over again and again and always a beginner and never an expert.
Yeah. Wonderful. Final question before we get to the three questions I sent you first. I mean, what you're publishing, the book's coming out in paperback, doubtless will be an enormous success as the hardback was. What are the new frontiers that you're exploring around this topic, Angela?
I am really interested in the difficulty that people have in developing their passion. I think that for some, they might think, oh, well, the hard work part, that's the hard part, the resilience part. But actually, so many young people in particular, and some who are not so young, have asked me, I am a hard worker. I've got a tremendous work ethic. I just don't know what I want to do with my life. And so that's work that I'm doing now. I actually think that the conversation we've had is a flag in that direction, because really what people need to do is to begin to develop their hierarchy of goals and to understand what for them will be a goal that they would be willing to and maybe enthusiastic really about sticking to for the rest of their lives. So I think that's one important direction. And then the second, as you said, is, how do you help a whole organization develop a culture of grit? Human beings are cultural animals, and we are profoundly influenced. How can we craft gritty cultures?
Yes. Fascinating. Well, I look forward to following your work, because those are two very interesting dimensions. Fantastic. So I sent you some questions before, Angela, and I don't want to blindside you. So let's see where we get to on this. First question. What have you changed your mind about recently?
I think one thing I've changed my mind about is that the grit scale, which I've published in the book and, is a helpful tool for reflection, is actually what my research is based on. I see the limitations, and I see the limitations in particular in these passion items. So if you take the grit scale, you get items like, I've had interests that have stayed the same from year to year, and, I don't get bored of things. I mean, those kinds of items, to give you a flavor of them. And I think that one thing I could have done better, and I just want to say this to those who are listening, is that, there is a kind of, voluntary obsession that I don't think these items quite get to, a kind of intensity and as one poet put it to me, it's like a dog with a rag in its teeth, but I'm not the dog, I'm the rag, so I'm really interested in how, we could get better and I could get better at measuring passion. I would say that's one of the things. And then, I also think that understanding more and more about the limitations of what you can do in an environment, for example, in healthcare, levels of burnout are epidemic. And I can't believe that's because, doctors and nurses are less gritty. It must be because of things in that healthcare industry that are really eroding people's ability to be their best.
Yeah. Excellent. Second question. Where do you go to get fresh perspectives to stay innovative and creative?
I mostly enjoy talking to people who are not scientists. So, for example, yesterday I spent my morning with a doctor named Scott Levin. He's a hand surgeon who is just a case study in grit. He was rejected by 30 medical schools. The last medical school to reject him was his alma mater. He was his undergraduate university called Duke University in the United States. And on that day, he walked down the graduation aisle. He may have had the rejection letter in his hand. And he muttered to himself, "I'll show you." And then, in fact, that's exactly what he did. He's now, a pioneer in the field. He's the president of the Society of Physicians who specialize in his domain. And I would say that when I talk to, a hand hand surgeon or a ballerina or, a swimmer, I learn at least as much as when I read a scientific article.
Brilliant, brilliant. And then the final question, what's been your most significant failure or low? What have you learned from it and how have you applied that learning?
I'm not especially brilliant at parenting, despite writing about it and thinking about it a lot. I'm a mother of a 16-year-old and a 15-year-old, and maybe it's their age, but they are very quick to point out all of their mother's limitations. And, they're very accurate, actually. I will just say that, I want to be empathic to all those leaders and parents out there. When you have bad days and you think, wow, I said exactly the wrong thing, I did exactly the wrong thing, to have some compassion as well, because grit is not easy to be. It is not easy to cultivate. But we should be gritty in doing it, right? We should have some compassion for ourselves and we should get up again and try to do a better job the next day as a mother, as a father, as a CEO, and as anyone else who cares about being their best self.
Yeah, yeah. No, I'm a parent as well of similar age, and I read something that helped me yesterday. Actually, parenting is less like carpentry and it's more like gardening. And we beat ourselves up when our carpentry falls afoul, but actually it's about creating the environment and the conditions, which is harder to measure, right?
I love that. I love that. And also, there's a lot of things that you can't control in gardening, like the weather. And I think
exactly
that's the
exactly
perfect metaphor for it. That's terrific.
So, Angela, where can people get in touch with you?
I have a website, and I will tell you I have two, but I will tell you the one that I'd love to have people visit. It's characterlab.org.
Mm-hmm.
So that's where we put up all of our scientific evidence translated into actionable advice for parents and teachers, philanthropically funded. So everything is free and downloadable, and you can use it without permission. I also have a personal website named AngelaDuckworth.com. And so there are some other free resources there. So whether you're a parent or teacher or whether you're someone else, hopefully these two websites will help you.
Wonderful. Well, Angela, very pleased to meet you. As I said, loved your book. I'm sure our audience will enjoy this interview and be encouraged to go out and get the book. It's a great read, and there's a huge number of people who've commented, many of whom are well known in the front cover. So it's a wonderful read. Thanks for your work. Look forward to perhaps having you back on the show when you've answered some of the other questions you referred to earlier on.
I would love that. I really enjoyed this conversation. I really enjoyed your questions.
Great. Well, have a great day. So I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Angela as much as I did. It really is powerful, this combination of passion and perseverance. How our passions can and should be cultivated in service of us performing at a higher level, and how perseverance is about deliberate practice as well as an ability to be resilient and manage setbacks. And it was interesting to learn how Angela shares the rejections of her papers with her students in order to role model grit. And it's our preference, I think, to see success as a result of people's natural talents. So it's very easy for others to assume that a highly talented individual like Angela does not have to suffer the knocks that others do. But by very publicly sharing her setbacks and impact that they have on her, Angela is modeling grit, and she's showing the way to building the perseverance needed to achieve success. So if any leaders listening to this, here is a real way that you can actually take action in order to create and start building a culture of grit in your organization. I hope our discussion on the difference between perseverance and stubbornness also provided food for thought. While we would expect our top-level goals to be stable and decided upon after the most careful consideration, we will likely have to change tactics at different times in pursuit of these goals, to show perseverance to achieve your goals and to avoid being stubborn about the approaches taken to make these happen. Or as Angela and her fellow University of Pennsylvania professor colleague Adam Grant put it, be original, creative, and outside the box, thinking about all the ways that you can accomplish your goal. But if you keep changing the top-level goal, you're also unlikely to get anywhere. I also liked how she refers for the need for us to work on our craft. And this is a concept that a previous guest, Michael Gervais, really goes into in a lot of detail in episode 34. Now, finally, before I wrap up, I'd like to do a shout out for the great team behind this podcast. Nev, Danilo, and Emma all play key roles in transcribing the episode, producing the final audio files, and pushing it out across our various platforms. So Nev, Danilo, Emma, many thanks for your diligence and for your support. We really do appreciate it. So this is Mark Bidwell, changing perspectives, one podcast at a time.